They laughed when she stumbled during the morning drills. They whispered behind her back when she struggled with the obstacle course. They called her weak, soft, and questioned why someone like her even bothered to show up at the most demanding military training facility in the country. But what they didn't know was that beneath her standard-issue uniform lay a story written in ink across her back, a tattoo that would silence every critic and earn the respect of the toughest commander the Academy had ever seen. This is the true story of Maria Santos, a woman who transformed mockery into triumph, proving that sometimes the most powerful weapons we carry are invisible to the naked eye. What happened when that tattoo was finally revealed would change not just her military career, but the way an entire unit understood the meaning of true strength and sacrifice. The morning sun cast long shadows across the dusty training ground as Maria Santos stepped off the military transport bus. At 24, she was older than most recruits, and her petite frame seemed almost fragile compared to the towering figures of her fellow trainees. The Fort Braxton Special Forces training facility was known for breaking even the strongest candidates, and, as Maria grabbed her single duffel bag, she could already feel the weight of skeptical stares from the other recruits. "This isn't summer camp, sweetheart," muttered Jackson, a broad-shouldered ex-football player from Texas, as he shouldered past her. His comment drew snickers from the group of male recruits who had clearly already bonded over their shared assumption that Maria didn't belong here. Maria said nothing. She had learned long ago that words meant little when actions could speak volumes. But, as she followed the group toward the registration building, she couldn't help but touch the fabric at her back, feeling the raised edges of the intricate tattoo that lay hidden beneath her civilian clothes. Soon, she would trade these clothes for the standard-issue uniforms that all recruits wore, and her secret would remain safely concealed. The registration process was a blur of paperwork, medical examinations, and equipment distribution. Maria moved through each station methodically, answering questions with quiet confidence while the other recruits continued their casual assessment of her chances of survival. By lunchtime, the unofficial betting pool had her washing out within the first week. "I give her 3 days," said Rodriguez, a former gang member from Los Angeles who had joined the military as an alternative to prison time. "She looks like she's never seen a push-up, let alone done one." The cruel commentary continued as they collected their uniforms and were assigned to their barracks. Maria found herself in Bay 7, a long room lined with metal bunk beds and footlockers. She claimed the bottom bunk in the far corner, hoping to keep a low profile during these first critical days. As she unpacked her belongings, she noticed that her bunkmate was Rebecca, a tough-looking woman from Detroit with arms covered in amateur tattoos and a reputation for street fighting. "So what's your story?" Rebecca asked, sitting heavily on her top bunk. "Rich girl playing soldier, or running from something?" Maria folded her civilian clothes carefully before answering. "Just here to serve my country." Rebecca snorted. "Right. We're all here for noble reasons. Look around, princess. Half these guys are here because they couldn't cut it anywhere else, and the other half are trying to prove something to daddy. Nobody comes to Special Forces training just to serve." Before Maria could respond, the sharp blast of a whistle echoed through the barracks. Sergeant Blake, their drill instructor, stood in the doorway with the kind of expression that suggested he had been waiting for this moment all day. "Listen up, maggots. In 60 seconds, you will be on the parade ground in full uniform for your first formation. If you're late, you'll be doing push-ups until I get tired of counting. Move." The scramble that followed was chaotic. Maria quickly changed into her uniform, her fingers working efficiently with the buttons and laces despite the time pressure. She had practiced this routine dozens of times in her small apartment back home, preparing for this moment. As she pulled on her boots, she caught her reflection in the small mirror mounted on her footlocker. The woman looking back at her bore little resemblance to the person who had arrived just hours earlier. Gone was any trace of uncertainty, replaced by a steely determination that had carried her through much more difficult challenges than military training. The formation was her first real test. Sergeant Blake walked slowly down the line of recruits, stopping in front of each one to deliver a personalized assessment of their shortcomings. When he reached Maria, he paused for a long moment, his eyes taking in her small stature and youthful appearance. "Santos, is it?" he growled, consulting his clipboard. "Yes, Sergeant." What makes you think you can handle Special Forces training, Santos? You look like a strong breeze would knock you over. The question hung in the air, and Maria could feel the eyes of every recruit boring into her. This was the moment she had anticipated, the first of many times she would have to prove herself worthy of being here. I guess we'll find out, Sergeant, she replied evenly. Blake's eyebrows rose slightly. He had expected pleading, justification, or perhaps nervous bravado. The calm confidence in her voice was unexpected from someone who looked like she should be teaching kindergarten instead of training for special operations. We certainly will, Santos. We certainly will. The first week of training was a brutal introduction to military life. Each day began before dawn with physical training that pushed every recruit to their limits and beyond. Maria struggled with some of the exercises, particularly those that required pure upper body strength, but she completed every rep, finished every run, and never once asked for special consideration. Her determination didn't go unnoticed by her fellow recruits, but it also didn't earn their respect. If anything, her persistence seemed to irritate them more than if she had simply given up. They interpreted her refusal to quit as stubbornness rather than strength, and the comments became more frequent and more cutting. Hey Santos, you sure you don't want to transfer to the Army band? Called out Williams during their third morning run. I heard they need someone to carry the triangle. The laughter that followed felt like a physical blow, but Maria kept running. She had endured worse humiliation and survived greater challenges than anything these recruits could throw at her. But, as the days wore on, the isolation became harder to bear than the physical demands of training. It was during the second week that things took a more serious turn. The unit was introduced to close-quarters combat training, and partners were assigned for sparring exercises. Maria found herself paired with Thompson, a former college wrestler who outweighed her by at least 60 pounds. The size difference was so obvious that even Sergeant Blake seemed to hesitate before confirming the pairing. Problem with your partner, Santos? Blake asked when he noticed her expression. No problem, Sergeant. But there was a problem, and everyone on the training mat knew it. Thompson was not just larger than Maria, he was also one of the recruits who had been most vocal in his belief that women didn't belong in special forces. The combination of his size advantage and his desire to prove a point created a dangerous situation. The sparring session began with basic grappling techniques, but it quickly became apparent that Thompson was using far more force than necessary. What should have been a controlled exercise became a showcase of his superior strength, with Maria spending most of the time on the defensive, trying to avoid being injured. Come on, Santos, Thompson taunted as he easily countered her attempts to apply the techniques they had been taught. I thought you were tough enough for special forces. Maria absorbed the punishment without complaint, but she could see the other recruits gathering to watch what was becoming less of a training exercise and more of a public humiliation. Even some of the instructors had stopped their own sessions to observe, though none intervened. The session ended with Maria on her back, Thompson's forearm pressed against her throat in a chokehold that was both technically correct and unnecessarily aggressive. As she tapped out, signaling her submission, she heard the scattered applause from the watching recruits and saw the satisfied smirk on Thompson's face. Good hustle, Santos, he said loudly enough for everyone to hear. Maybe next time you'll land a punch. That night, alone in her bunk while Rebecca was at the base exchange, Maria allowed herself a moment of doubt. She had known the training would be difficult, but she hadn't fully prepared for the psychological warfare that came with being different. The physical challenges were manageable, but the constant undermining of her confidence was wearing her down in ways she hadn't expected. She reached back and touched the edge of her tattoo through her shirt, feeling the familiar raised lines that told her story better than words ever could. The ink had been applied over several painful sessions, each line representing a memory she could never forget. But it also represented a strength that these recruits couldn't imagine and a resilience that had been tested in ways far more severe than anything military training could offer. As she lay in the darkness, listening to the sounds of the base settling into night, Maria made a decision. She would not quit, no matter how badly they wanted her to fail. She would endure their mockery, survive their challenges, and prove that their assumptions about her were wrong. And, when the time was right, when she had earned the standing to command their attention, she would show them the truth that had been hidden beneath her uniform all along. The next morning brought new challenges and familiar taunts, but something had changed in Maria's demeanor. She moved with a new sense of purpose, her responses to the harassment becoming shorter and more focused. She was no longer trying to fit in or win their approval, she was simply preparing for the moment when she could prove them all wrong. That moment was coming sooner than anyone expected. The third week of training brought the most challenging phase yet, advanced tactical exercises that would test not just physical endurance but mental toughness and team cohesion. Maria had managed to keep pace with most of the physical requirements, though she still struggled with some of the strength-based challenges. Her persistence had earned a grudging acknowledgement from a few instructors, but her fellow recruits remained convinced that she was a liability waiting to happen. The morning briefing took place in a classroom with concrete walls covered in tactical diagrams and military doctrine posters. Commander Harrison, the facility's commanding officer, stood at the front of the room with the bearing of someone who had seen real combat and survived to tell about it. He was a legend among military training personnel, known for his fairness but also for his absolute intolerance of weakness that could get soldiers killed in the field. "Today we begin what we call the Crucible," Commander Harrison announced, his voice carrying the authority of 3 decades of military service. "Over the next 5 days, you will be tested in scenarios designed to simulate real-world special operations missions. You will work in teams, and the success or failure of your team will determine whether you continue in this program." Maria felt her stomach tighten. Team exercises had been her greatest fear throughout the training process. While she could push herself through individual challenges through sheer determination, team scenarios required the cooperation and trust of her fellow recruits, something she had been unable to achieve despite weeks of trying. "Team assignments are non-negotiable," Harrison continued. "You will work with whoever you are assigned to work with, and you will find a way to succeed together or you will fail together. There are no individual heroes in special operations." The team assignments were read aloud, and Maria found herself grouped with Thompson, Rodriguez, Williams, and 2 other recruits who had been particularly vocal in their criticism of her presence in the program. As the teams were dismissed to begin their first exercise, she heard Thompson address the group in a voice loud enough for her to hear. "Great. We got stuck with dead weight. Might as well pack our bags now." The first exercise was a night navigation course through dense woods surrounding the training facility. Each team was given coordinates for 5 checkpoints and a time limit of 6 hours to locate all of them and return to base. They would be carrying full field packs weighing 40 pounds and would have to maintain radio contact with base every hour. The exercise began at sunset, with temperatures dropping rapidly as the teams dispersed into the forest. Maria's team started strong, with Rodriguez taking point as their navigator and Thompson carrying the radio equipment. For the first 2 hours, they moved efficiently through the terrain, locating the first 3 checkpoints ahead of schedule. But, as the night grew darker and the temperature continued to drop, the physical demands began to take their toll. Maria's smaller frame meant she had to work harder to keep pace with the longer strides of her teammates, and the weight of her pack began to feel crushing as they climbed increasingly steep terrain. "Santos, move your ass," Williams hissed as the gap between Maria and the rest of the team widened during their approach to the 4th checkpoint. "We're going to miss our radio check because of you." Maria pushed herself harder, ignoring the burning sensation in her lungs and the ache in her shoulders where the pack straps cut into her muscles. She had done longer marches under worse conditions, but never with the added pressure of knowing that her performance was being scrutinized by teammates who wanted her to fail. The 4th checkpoint was located on a rocky outcropping that required a challenging climb up a nearly vertical rock face. The other team members ascended quickly, using their upper body strength to pull themselves up the natural handholds. Maria attempted the same route but found herself unable to generate enough pulling power to make progress. "Just great," Thompson muttered as he watched her struggle. "We're going to be here all night." "Maybe she should wait at the bottom," suggested Rodriguez. "We can get the checkpoint and come back for her." The suggestion stung more than any of the direct insults they had thrown at her over the past weeks. Being left behind would be an admission that she couldn't contribute to the team's success, a failure that would likely result in her dismissal from the program. "I can make it," Maria said, searching the rock face for an alternative route. She found a more gradual path that would take longer but required less pure strength.
Give me 5 minutes. We don't have 5 minutes, Williams snapped. We're already behind schedule because of you.
But Maria was already moving, using her smaller size to her advantage as she navigated through gaps in the rock that the larger men couldn't fit through. Her route was more difficult to follow, but it allowed her to reach the checkpoint only minutes after her teammates. The small victory did nothing to improve the team's attitude toward her. If anything, her success seemed to irritate them more, as if her refusal to accept defeat was a personal affront to their judgment of her abilities. The final checkpoint was the most challenging yet, located in a swampy area where the ground was unstable and the cold water came up to their knees. The team had to cross nearly a mile of this terrain in complete darkness, guided only by compass bearings and the occasional glimpse of stars through the forest canopy. It was in this final stretch that disaster struck. Rodriguez, who had been serving as their navigator, stepped into what appeared to be solid ground but turned out to be a hidden sinkhole filled with frigid water. He went under completely, his pack and equipment disappearing beneath the dark surface. The team reacted quickly, with Thompson and Williams forming a human chain to pull Rodriguez from the water. He emerged gasping and shivering, his body temperature already dropping dangerously in the cold night air. Their radio was soaked and non-functional, their maps were waterlogged and unreadable, and Rodriguez was showing early signs of hypothermia. "We need to get him warm and get back to base," Thompson said, his earlier antagonism replaced by genuine concern for his teammates' welfare. "But we're lost without the maps and radio." This was the moment Maria had been unconsciously preparing for throughout her military training. While the other team members focused on Rodriguez's immediate medical needs, she quickly assessed their situation and began formulating a solution. "I can get us back," she said quietly.
What are you talking about? Williams asked. The maps are ruined and you haven't been navigating.
"I've been tracking our route since we started," Maria replied, pulling out a small waterproof notebook from her shirt pocket. "I marked landmarks and compass bearings at every major turn." The team stared at her in surprise. None of them had noticed her making notes throughout their journey, and the idea that she had been maintaining an independent navigation record seemed to contradict their assessment of her as unprepared and overwhelmed.
"You sure about this?" Thompson asked, his tone lacking its usual hostility. "I'm sure."
What followed was a 2-hour forced march through difficult terrain, with Maria leading the team using her handwritten notes and a backup compass she had carried in her pack. Rodriguez's condition stabilized as they kept him moving and shared body heat during rest breaks, but the situation remained serious until they finally spotted the lights of the base facility. They arrived at base camp 45 minutes past their deadline, but they arrived together with all team members accounted for and the mission objectives completed. As they reported to the debriefing station, Commander Harrison was waiting with a medical team to attend to Rodriguez.
"What happened out there?" Harrison asked as Rodriguez was loaded onto a stretcher for transport to the base medical facility. Thompson looked at Maria for a long moment before answering. "Santos navigated us back when our primary navigation failed. Probably saved Rodriguez's life."
It was the first time any of her teammates had acknowledged her contribution to the team's success, and the admission seemed to cost Thompson considerable effort. But Maria barely heard the praise. She was thinking about Rodriguez, hoping that his injury wouldn't end his military career before it had truly begun. The incident in the swamp marked a turning point in how her teammates treated her, but it didn't end the harassment entirely. If anything, some of the other recruits seemed to resent the fact that she had proven herself useful in a crisis. The comments became more subtle but also more cutting, focusing on her appearance and questioning her motivations for being in the program. "Bet she's got some daddy issues to work out," Williams commented during their next team exercise. "Probably trying to prove something to someone who doesn't care." The comment hit closer to home than Williams could have known, and Maria felt a familiar tightness in her chest. But she had learned to use pain as motivation rather than letting it weaken her resolve. Each cruel comment, each skeptical look, each assumption about her background only strengthened her determination to prove them wrong. The breakthrough came during their 4th week of training, when the teams were assigned to a combat simulation exercise that would test their ability to work together under extreme stress. The scenario involved rescuing a captured teammate from a hostile compound, with live ammunition being used to create realistic combat conditions. Maria's team was assigned the role of the rescue force, while another team played the part of the enemy guards. The exercise was designed to be nearly impossible to complete successfully, with multiple layers of security and time pressure that would force teams to take significant risks. As they planned their approach to the target compound, Maria noticed something that her teammates had missed. The exercise controllers had placed the compound in a location that was overlooked by a water tower, but the tower could only be accessed from the blind side of the building through a drainage culvert that was too small for most adults to navigate. "I can get to that tower," she told the team during their planning session. "If I can establish a position there, I can provide overwatch for your approach and create a distraction when you need it." Thompson looked skeptical. "It's a long shot, Santos. If you get caught up there, we can't help you. And if I don't try, we're going to fail this exercise," Maria replied. "That tower is the only position that gives us tactical advantage." The team agreed to let her attempt the approach, though their body language suggested they expected her to fail. As they moved into position for the exercise to begin, Maria could hear Williams making quiet bets with Rodriguez about how long she would last before being captured. But Maria had prepared for this moment longer than they could imagine. As she crawled through the narrow drainage tunnel, fighting claustrophobia and the weight of her equipment, she drew on reserves of mental toughness that had been developed through experiences far more challenging than military training. The tattoo on her back seemed to burn with each movement forward, reminding her of why she had to succeed. She emerged from the tunnel at the base of the water tower just as the exercise began. The climb to the top was treacherous, requiring her to ascend a rusted ladder while carrying her rifle and radio equipment. But she reached the platform just as her teammates began their assault on the compound. From her elevated position, Maria could see the entire battlefield laid out below her. She quickly identified the positions of the enemy guards and began relaying tactical information to her team through her radio headset. Her accuracy and calm demeanor under pressure allowed her teammates to move through the compound with minimal resistance, reaching the captured teammate in record time. But the exercise wasn't over. As her team prepared to evacuate with their rescued colleague, enemy reinforcements arrived and threatened to cut off their escape route. Maria found herself in the position of having to provide covering fire from her tower position, engaging multiple targets while her teammates fought their way to safety. The engagement lasted only minutes, but it felt like hours. Maria's marksmanship training proved invaluable as she systematically eliminated the threats that were preventing her team's escape. By the time the exercise ended with a successful extraction, she had neutralized 6 enemy positions and coordinated a tactical withdrawal that military instructors would later use as a textbook example of small unit tactics. As the teams assembled for the after-action review, Maria could see the change in how her teammates looked at her. The skepticism and hostility had been replaced by something approaching respect, though grudging and reluctant. She had proven that she could not only keep up with their physical demands but could also contribute tactical value that none of them had anticipated. But the real test was yet to come. Commander Harrison had been observing the exercise, and his evaluation would determine whether Maria continued in the program or was transferred to a different military occupation. As the team members cleaned their weapons and equipment, they waited nervously for his assessment of their performance. The moment of truth was approaching, and Maria knew that everything she had worked for would be decided in the next few hours. Commander Harrison didn't speak for the first 10 minutes of the after-action review. He stood at the front of the classroom, studying the tactical diagrams that showed each team's movement through the exercise, making notes on his clipboard with the methodical precision of someone who had evaluated thousands of soldiers over his career. The silence in the room was deafening as the recruits waited for his assessment. Maria sat in the back row, her uniform still dusty from the crawl through the drainage tunnel and her hands slightly shaky from the adrenaline that was slowly fading from her system. She had performed well during the exercise, better than even she had expected, but she knew that Commander Harrison's standards were impossibly high. Good enough for other instructors might still be inadequate for the man who had trained some of the most elite soldiers in the military. I've been running tactical exercises at this facility for 15 years, Harrison finally began, his voice carrying the weight of authority that came from decades of real combat experience. In that time, I've seen recruits attempt every possible approach to the rescue scenario you just completed.
Most fail within the first 30 minutes.
Some manage partial success through luck or overwhelming force. He paused to look directly at Maria's team, his expression unreadable.
What I witnessed today was something different.
Your team achieved complete mission success with 0 casualties and minimal expenditure of ammunition.
That level of efficiency is rare even among experienced special operations units. A murmur ran through the room.
Complete mission success was almost unheard of during training exercises that were designed to be nearly impossible to complete successfully. However, Harrison continued, and Maria felt her stomach drop. Success achieved through the exceptional performance of one individual raises questions about team cohesion and collective capability. This was the moment Maria had been dreading. Her success in the water tower had made her teammates look better than they actually were, and now Harrison was questioning whether their achievement was legitimate or simply the result of her individual contribution covering up their collective weaknesses. Santos, Harrison called, and Maria felt every eye in the room turn toward her.
Step forward.
Maria rose from her seat and walked to the front of the classroom, her military bearing automatic despite the nervousness she felt inside. She stood at attention in front of Harrison, waiting for what she suspected would be her dismissal from the program. Your performance in today's exercise was exceptional, Harrison said, his voice loud enough for everyone in the room to hear. Your tactical awareness, marksmanship, and ability to coordinate a complex operation under pressure demonstrated skills that typically take years of training to develop. Maria remained at attention, uncertain whether this was praise or preparation for criticism.
However, exceptional individual performance means nothing if it can't be replicated consistently. Special operations soldiers don't succeed because of one perfect mission.
They succeed because they can perform at the highest level day after day, under conditions that would break most people. Harrison walked slowly around Maria as he spoke, his evaluation continuing in front of her teammates and the other recruits.
The question I have to answer is whether your performance today was an anomaly or an indication of your actual capability. One successful mission doesn't qualify someone for special operations.
Consistency under extreme pressure does.
The weight of his words settled over the room like a heavy blanket.
Maria understood that she was being put on notice, that her success in the exercise had earned her continued evaluation rather than automatic advancement in the program. Which brings us to your next test, Harrison continued. Tomorrow morning, you will participate in what we call the individual assessment. It's a 72-hour evaluation that will test every skill you've learned and several you haven't been taught yet. You'll be completely on your own, with no team support and no backup plan. Maria felt a chill run down her spine. The individual assessment was legendary among military training programs, a test so difficult that even mentioning it was enough to make experienced soldiers nervous. Most recruits never faced it because most recruits were eliminated from the program long before reaching that level of evaluation. The assessment begins at 0400 hours tomorrow, Harrison said. You'll be given a mission briefing and basic equipment, then transported to a location where you'll have to survive and complete objectives for 3 days with minimal support. The failure rate is approximately 80%.
The room was completely silent now.
Even the instructors seemed surprised that Harrison was subjecting a recruit to the individual assessment so early in the training cycle.
Why her? Thompson asked, speaking for the first time during the review.
I mean, she did well today, but we all did well.
Why is she getting special testing?
Harrison turned to face Thompson, his expression showing mild irritation at being questioned.
Because, Recruit Thompson, I don't have questions about your capabilities. I've seen your type 1,000 times.
You're big, strong, aggressive, and competent within the parameters of conventional military training.
Santos represents an unknown variable.
He gestured toward Maria as he continued. She doesn't fit the physical profile we typically associate with special operations personnel. Her approach to problems is different from standard military doctrine. And, yet her results suggest capabilities that exceed what her appearance would indicate.
I need to understand what we're dealing with.
The explanation made sense from a military perspective, but Maria could hear the underlying message. She was being tested not because she had proven herself, but because Harrison couldn't figure out how to categorize her.
She was an anomaly that needed to be either validated or eliminated before the program continued.
Understood, sir, Maria replied, her voice steady despite the turmoil she felt inside.
Good.
Report to equipment issue at 0330 hours for your assignment. Your mission briefing will be provided en route to the assessment location.
Dismissed.
As the other recruits filed out of the classroom, Maria remained behind to ask Harrison a question that had been bothering her since the exercise ended.
Sir, may I ask why the individual assessment normally comes later in the program? Harrison studied her for a moment before answering. Because by that point, we've eliminated the recruits who clearly don't belong here.
The assessment is designed for candidates who have already proven their basic competency and are ready for final evaluation.
And, you think I haven't proven my basic competency? I think you've proven something, Santos. I'm just not sure what it is yet. That evening, Maria lay in her bunk thinking about the challenge ahead.
The individual assessment was designed to break candidates who weren't mentally prepared for the isolation and pressure of special operations work. She would be completely alone, with no teammates to rely on and no instructors to provide guidance when things went wrong. But, as she thought about the test ahead, Maria realized that being alone might actually be an advantage. She had spent most of her life dealing with challenges in isolation, developing self-reliance and mental toughness that came from having no other choice. The assessment would finally give her the opportunity to demonstrate her true capabilities without having to worry about team dynamics or the skepticism of her peers.
Rebecca, her bunkmate, noticed her unusual quietness during the evening equipment check.
Heard Harrison's putting you through the individual assessment tomorrow, Rebecca said as she cleaned her rifle.
That's some serious pressure, even for someone who's been impressing the instructors.
Word travels fast around here, Maria replied.
Everything travels fast in military training.
So what's your story, really?
Nobody gets this kind of attention unless there's more going on than meets the eye.
It was the first time anyone had asked her directly about her background, and Maria considered how much to reveal. She had become skilled at deflecting personal questions, but something about Rebecca's direct approach made her want to answer honestly. I've had some experiences that prepared me for this kind of training, Maria said carefully.
What kind of experiences?
Maria touched the fabric over her back, feeling the raised lines of the tattoo that told her story better than words ever could. Soon, very soon, that story would become public knowledge.
But, not yet.
The kind that teach you to survive when survival seems impossible.
Rebecca nodded as if that explanation was sufficient. Fair enough. Just remember tomorrow that whatever brought you here, it's got you this far. Trust yourself.
The advice was simple, but it carried more weight than any of the tactical instruction Maria had received during weeks of training. Trust herself. It was something she had learned to do out of necessity, but she had never thought of it as a military skill. The next morning arrived with the brutal efficiency of military routine. Maria reported to equipment issue before dawn and received her gear for the assessment: basic survival equipment, a rifle with limited ammunition, a radio for emergency use only, and a sealed envelope containing her mission briefing. The transport to the assessment location was a silent 30-minute ride in the back of a military truck. As they traveled through the darkness toward an unknown destination, Maria opened the sealed envelope and read her mission objectives for the first time. The assessment would take place in a wilderness area covering approximately 50 square miles of mountainous terrain. Her mission was to locate and photograph 3 specific landmarks, avoid detection by hunter teams that would be actively searching for her, and survive for 72 hours with the equipment she carried. The landmarks were identified only by grid coordinates and brief descriptions. The first was described as a stone marker left by early settlers. The second was a natural rock formation resembling an animal. The third was simply the highest point visible from the second landmark. Maria studied the topographical map provided with her briefing, noting the elevation changes and natural features that would affect her movement through the area. The terrain was challenging but not impossible, with dense forest cover that would provide concealment but also make navigation more difficult. What concerned her most was the mention of hunter teams. These would be experienced military personnel whose job was to locate and capture assessment candidates. Being caught by a hunter team meant automatic failure, regardless of how well she performed the other mission objectives. The truck came to a stop just as the first hints of dawn appeared on the eastern horizon. The driver opened the back panel and gestured for Maria to exit.
"This is your insertion point," he said without ceremony.
"Good luck." Maria shouldered her pack and stepped out into the cool morning air. The truck disappeared back down the dirt road, leaving her completely alone in an unfamiliar wilderness with nothing but her training, her equipment, and the knowledge that her entire military career would be determined by what happened over the next 3 days. She took a moment to orient herself using the map and compass, identifying key terrain features that would guide her movement toward the first objective. The stone marker was approximately 8 miles away through difficult terrain, and she needed to reach it while avoiding the hunter teams that were probably already in position. As she began moving through the forest, Maria felt a familiar sense of calm settle over her. This was what she had been preparing for without realizing it, a test that would require every skill she possessed and several she would have to develop along the way. For the first time since arriving at the training facility, she was truly in her element. The individual assessment had begun, and, with it, the final test of whether Maria Santos belonged in special operations or would be transferred to a different military occupation. But, as she disappeared into the wilderness, moving with the stealth and purpose of someone who had learned survival skills through necessity rather than instruction, it was clear that this assessment would test more than just her military training. It would test the very core of who she was and what had brought her to this moment. The first 12 hours of the individual assessment pushed Maria beyond anything she had experienced during formal military training. The terrain was more challenging than the maps had indicated, with steep ravines hidden by dense undergrowth and streams that appeared and disappeared without following any logical pattern. She had covered only 4 miles in 6 hours of careful movement, constantly checking for signs of the hunter teams while navigating toward her first objective. The stone marker proved to be more elusive than she had anticipated. The grid coordinates led her to a hillside covered in granite outcroppings, any one of which could be the marker left by early settlers mentioned in her briefing. After 2 hours of methodical searching, she found what appeared to be a deliberately placed stone cairn hidden among the natural rock formations. The marker itself was unremarkable, just a stack of weathered stones that could have been built decades or centuries earlier. But, as Maria photographed it from multiple angles as required, she noticed something that made her pause. Carved into the largest stone, almost invisible unless viewed from exactly the right angle, were initials and a date, MC 1847. Someone named MC had been in this exact location nearly 200 years ago, probably facing challenges and uncertainties not unlike what Maria was experiencing now. The connection across time gave her an unexpected sense of comfort as she prepared to move toward her second objective. But finding the stone marker had taken longer than planned, and she was behind schedule when she heard the first signs of a hunter team moving through the forest below her position. The sound of breaking branches and muffled voices carried clearly in the still air, indicating that at least 4 people were conducting a systematic search of the valley she had planned to use for her approach to the second landmark. Maria settled into a concealed position behind a fallen log and waited for the team to pass. Through her rifle scope, she could see them moving in a standard search formation, sweeping back and forth across the terrain with the patience and thoroughness of professionals who knew their job well. They were equipped with advanced communication gear and moved with a coordination that suggested extensive training in tracking human targets. Watching them work, Maria realized that avoiding detection would require more than just staying quiet and out of sight. These teams were using techniques specifically designed to locate people trying to hide from them. They would check obvious hiding places, look for signs of recent passage, and probably had thermal imaging equipment that could detect body heat even through forest cover. She would need to think like prey rather than predator, using every natural advantage available while assuming that her pursuers were better equipped and more experienced than she was. It was a mindset that came naturally to her, drawing on survival instincts that had been developed through experiences far removed from military training. The hunter team spent nearly an hour searching the valley before moving on toward a different sector. Maria waited an additional 30 minutes before emerging from her hiding place, using the time to study her map and plan an alternative route that would avoid the areas where search teams were most likely to operate. The second objective, described as a natural rock formation resembling an animal, was located in an area of exposed granite cliffs approximately 6 miles from her current position. The direct route would take her across open ground that offered no concealment, but a more circuitous path through a series of connected ravines would add several miles to her journey while keeping her hidden from observation. Maria chose the longer route, accepting the additional time and energy cost in exchange for better security. As she moved through the ravines, she began to notice signs that other candidates had passed through the area before her. Broken branches, disturbed soil, and even a few drops of blood on a rocky ledge indicated that the assessment was taking a serious toll on the people attempting it. The discovery of the blood was particularly concerning. It suggested that someone had been injured seriously enough to leave a blood trail, possibly during an encounter with a hunter team or perhaps just from the physical demands of moving through difficult terrain with heavy equipment. Either way, it was a reminder that the assessment was dangerous in ways that went beyond simple physical endurance. As the afternoon wore on, Maria found herself drawing on survival skills that she had learned outside of any formal military context. She moved through the wilderness with an efficiency that surprised even her, finding water sources by observing the flight patterns of birds, identifying edible plants that could supplement her limited rations, and reading the terrain with an intuitive understanding that came from experiences she rarely talked about. It was during a rest break near a small stream that she first became aware of being watched. The feeling was subtle at first, just a sense of unease that made her check her surroundings more carefully than usual. But, as she scanned the forest around her, she caught a glimpse of movement that didn't match the natural rhythm of wind and wildlife. Someone was tracking her, staying just far enough back to avoid direct observation while maintaining visual contact. The realization sent a chill through her that had nothing to do with the dropping temperature as evening approached. Maria continued her movement toward the second objective, but now every step was calculated to reveal information about her pursuer while giving away as little as possible about her own intentions. She deliberately chose routes that would force anyone following her to expose themselves, pausing frequently to observe her back trail and listen for sounds that didn't belong in the natural environment. The cat and mouse game continued for 2 hours before Maria finally got a clear look at who was following her. Through her rifle scope, she identified a single hunter team member moving alone through the forest approximately 300 yards behind her position. He was good at what he did, but he was also operating without backup in terrain that favored the person being hunted rather than the hunter. The tactical situation had suddenly become much more interesting. Instead of simply avoiding detection, Maria now had the opportunity to turn the tables on her pursuer. If she could capture photographic evidence of successfully evading or outmaneuvering a hunter team member, it would demonstrate capabilities that went far beyond what was typically expected during the individual assessment. But, attempting to engage with a hunter team member, even from a distance, carried enormous risks. If she failed, if she was detected or captured, her assessment would end immediately. Everything she had worked for would be lost because of a single tactical mistake. Maria found herself facing the kind of decision that would define not just her assessment results but her entire understanding of her own capabilities. Play it safe and complete the minimum requirements, or take the risk necessary to demonstrate that she was exceptional rather than merely adequate. The choice wasn't difficult. She had come too far and endured too much to settle for adequate. She spent the next hour setting up what military tacticians would recognize as a classic ambush scenario. Using the terrain to her advantage, she positioned herself where she could observe multiple approach routes while remaining concealed from anyone moving through the area. Then, she created subtle signs of her passage that would draw her pursuer into a predictable path. The plan worked perfectly. The hunter team member, following the trail she had deliberately left for him, moved into her observation area exactly where she had predicted he would. From her concealed position, Maria photographed him as he examined the false clues she had planted, capturing clear evidence that she had not only evaded detection but had successfully manipulated a trained professional into a tactical disadvantage. The photographs would serve as proof that her capabilities exceeded the basic requirements of the assessment, but they also represented something more significant. They demonstrated a level of tactical thinking and operational capability that couldn't be taught in any classroom or training exercise. As her pursuer eventually moved on, apparently convinced that he had lost her trail, Maria felt a sense of satisfaction that went beyond simply completing another mission objective. She had proven to herself that her instincts and training were sufficient to handle challenges that most people would find overwhelming. But the assessment was far from over. She still needed to locate the third objective, survive another day and night in the wilderness, and make it to the extraction point without being captured by any of the other hunter teams operating in the area. The third objective, described simply as the highest point visible from the second landmark, proved to be the most challenging yet. After finally locating the rock formation that resembled an animal, a weathered granite outcropping that looked vaguely like a sleeping bear when viewed from the correct angle, Maria had to climb to an exposed position where she could survey the surrounding terrain. The highest visible point was a rocky peak approximately 2 miles away, accessible only by a route that would take her across open ground during daylight hours. It was exactly the kind of movement that the hunter teams would be watching for, and attempting it would require timing and route selection that left no margin for error. Maria spent the remainder of the evening studying the terrain and planning her approach. The peak could be reached by following a ridgeline that offered some concealment, but only if she moved during the early morning hours when low-hanging mist would provide additional cover. She settled into a defensive position for the night, eating a cold meal from her emergency rations while reviewing everything that had happened during the first day of the assessment. By any measure, she was succeeding beyond expectations. She had located 2 of 3 objectives, evaded detection by multiple hunter teams, and even turned the tables on one of her pursuers. But success in the individual assessment required more than just completing the assigned missions. It required demonstrating the kind of mental toughness and adaptability that would allow someone to operate independently in hostile environments for extended periods. The real test would come during the final day, when exhaustion and stress would make every decision more difficult and every mistake more costly. As she tried to sleep despite the cold and the knowledge that hunter teams were still searching for her, Maria found herself thinking about the journey that had brought her to this moment. The assessment was testing skills that she had developed long before joining the military, capabilities that had been forged by experiences that had nothing to do with formal training or military doctrine. Tomorrow would determine whether those experiences had prepared her for the demands of special operations work, or whether she would join the 80% of candidates who failed to complete the individual assessment successfully. But tonight, alone in the wilderness with nothing but her own resources to rely on, Maria Santos felt more confident than she had at any point since arriving at the training facility. This was her element, and tomorrow she would prove it conclusively. The final day of the individual assessment began before dawn with Maria moving through the morning mist toward her third and final objective. She had slept only fitfully during the cold night, waking frequently to check for signs of hunter teams and monitoring the weather conditions that would affect her final approach to the rocky peak. The mist provided perfect concealment for the first part of her movement, allowing her to cross the exposed terrain without being observed. But, as the sun rose higher and the mist began to dissipate, Maria found herself in increasingly dangerous territory. The ridgeline leading to the peak offered limited hiding places, and she would be visible to anyone watching from the surrounding hills. It was during this final approach that she encountered her most serious challenge yet. As she crested a small hill, she came face to face with 2 hunter team members who had positioned themselves exactly where she needed to go. They were equipped with thermal imaging equipment and radio gear, and their position blocked the only practical route to her objective. Maria immediately dropped into concealment behind a boulder, her mind racing through tactical options. She could try to wait them out, hoping they would move to a different position, but time was running short and she needed to photograph the peak before her 72-hour deadline expired. She could attempt to find an alternative route, but the terrain offered no other practical approach. Or she could do something that would either prove her exceptional capabilities or end her military career before it truly began. Through her rifle scope, Maria studied the 2 hunter team members carefully. They were positioned approximately 200 yards away, scanning the surrounding area with the systematic thoroughness of professionals. But their position, while tactically sound for observing approaches to the peak, also made them vulnerable to someone willing to take significant risks. Maria made her decision with the cold calculation of someone who had learned to survive by making difficult choices under extreme pressure. Instead of avoiding the hunter team, she would use them to demonstrate capabilities that would end any questions about whether she belonged in special operations. She spent 30 minutes moving into position, using every piece of concealment available while closing the distance to her targets. The approach required her to cross open ground several times, relying on timing and the hunter team's predictable observation patterns to avoid detection. When she was within 50 yards of their position, Maria did something that would have been considered reckless by any military instructor but which demonstrated tactical thinking that went far beyond conventional training. Instead of trying to sneak past the hunter team, she deliberately triggered their attention by moving into their field of view just long enough to be noticed. The reaction was immediate and predictable. Both team members began moving to intercept what they assumed was a candidate trying to reach the objective. They split up to cover multiple approach routes, communicating through hand signals as they maneuvered into position for capture. But Maria was no longer where they expected her to be. While they focused on the area where they had seen movement, she had already repositioned to a location that allowed her to observe their movements while remaining completely concealed. From her new position, she photographed both team members as they searched for her, capturing clear evidence that she had not only evaded capture but had manipulated experienced professionals into revealing their positions and tactics. The photographs were more than just proof of her success, they demonstrated a level of tactical sophistication that was rarely seen even among experienced special operations personnel. She had turned a defensive situation into an offensive opportunity, using her opponent's own skills against them. With the hunter team thoroughly confused about her location and movements, Maria was able to complete her movement to the peak and photograph the final objective. The view from the summit revealed the full scope of the assessment area, with the locations of her 3 objectives forming a triangle that covered nearly 20 square miles of challenging terrain. But, as she prepared to begin her movement toward the extraction point, Maria realized that her unconventional tactics had created a new problem. Her manipulation of the hunter team had been so effective that they had called for reinforcements, and the radio chatter she could monitor indicated that additional teams were converging on her area. What should have been a routine movement to the extraction point had become a complex evasion exercise against multiple trained opponents who were now actively hunting her with the kind of intensity usually reserved for real combat operations. Maria found herself facing the ultimate test of everything she had learned during her military training and everything she had experienced before joining the military. She had 12 hours to cover 8 miles of difficult terrain while avoiding detection by an unknown number of highly trained professionals who were now treating her as a serious threat rather than just another assessment candidate. The movement to extraction became a masterpiece of tactical thinking and operational capability. Maria used every technique she had learned and several she improvised on the spot, moving through terrain that offered minimal concealment while staying ahead of pursuers who were becoming increasingly frustrated by their inability to locate her. She crossed streams to break her scent trail, used rocky areas to avoid leaving footprints, and even backtracked on her own route to confuse anyone trying to follow her path. At one point, she spent 2 hours hidden in a drainage culvert while 3 different hunter teams searched the area around her, their radio communications revealing their growing amazement at her ability to seemingly disappear from areas they had surrounded. It was during this final evasion that Maria began to understand something important about herself and her relationship to the military training she had been undergoing. The skills that were making her successful in the assessment hadn't been learned in any classroom or training exercise. They had been developed through experiences that had nothing to do with military service, forged by necessity during a time in her life when survival had required capabilities that most people never needed to develop. As she finally reached the extraction point with 2 hours to spare before her deadline, Maria realized that the individual assessment had tested more than just her military training. It had revealed capabilities that she had carried with her into military service, skills that had been developed through experiences that had shaped her long before she ever considered joining the special operations community. The extraction helicopter arrived exactly on schedule, piloted by the same crew that had transported her to the assessment area 3 days earlier. As she climbed aboard, exhausted but successful, Maria caught a glimpse of herself in the aircraft's window. She looked different than she had when the assessment began, not just physically tired but somehow more confident, more certain of her place in the world. The flight back to the training facility gave her time to reflect on everything that had happened during the 72 hours in the wilderness. She had not only completed all assigned objectives but had exceeded expectations in ways that would probably influence how the individual assessment was conducted for future candidates. But, more importantly, she had proven something to herself about who she was and what she was capable of achieving. The assessment had been designed to break candidates who weren't mentally prepared for the isolation and pressure of special operations work, but, for Maria, being alone with nothing but her own resources had felt like coming home. When the helicopter touched down at the training facility, Commander Harrison was waiting on the landing pad with an expression that Maria couldn't interpret. As she gathered her gear and prepared to debrief her assessment performance, she wondered what his evaluation would be and whether her unconventional approach would be seen as innovative thinking or dangerous recklessness. The debriefing took place in Harrison's office, a sparse room decorated only with military awards and photographs of soldiers who had passed through his training programs over the years. Maria sat at attention while Harrison reviewed the reports submitted by the hunter teams, his expression becoming increasingly thoughtful as he read. "The hunter teams submitted some interesting observations about your performance," Harrison said without looking up from his paperwork. "They describe tactics that aren't taught in any military training program and capabilities that exceed what we typically expect from assessment candidates." Maria remained silent, uncertain whether this was criticism or praise. "They also indicate that you not only evaded detection but actively manipulated their movements and used their own skills against them. That level of tactical thinking suggests training or experience that isn't reflected in your military record." This was the moment Maria had been anticipating since the beginning of her military training. The question about where her capabilities had come from, the inevitable inquiry into the experiences that had shaped her before she joined the military. "Permission to speak freely, sir?" "Granted." Maria took a deep breath, knowing that what she said next would determine not just her future in the Special Operations Program but how she would be perceived by the military community for the rest of her career. "My capabilities weren't developed through formal training, sir. They were developed through necessity, during a period of my life when survival required skills that most people never need to learn." Harrison finally looked up from his papers, his expression indicating genuine interest rather than skepticism. "Elaborate." "I spent 3 years as a prisoner of war, sir. Captured during a humanitarian mission in South America when I was 19 years old. The skills that allowed me to succeed in the assessment were developed during my captivity and escape." The statement hung in the air between them, explaining everything and raising new questions at the same time. Harrison's expression shifted from interest to something approaching amazement as the implications of her revelation became clear. "You were a POW for 3 years, and this isn't reflected in your military record?" "Because I wasn't military personnel at the time, sir. I was a civilian aid worker who was in the wrong place at the wrong time. The military wasn't involved in my capture or my escape." Harrison leaned back in his chair, studying Maria with new understanding. The puzzle pieces were finally falling into place, explaining the contradiction between her appearance and her capabilities, between her apparent inexperience and her exceptional performance. "Your tattoo," he said suddenly. "That's what this is about, isn't it? Your tattoo tells the story of your captivity." Maria felt her breath catch. Throughout her military training, she had successfully kept the tattoo hidden, changing clothes in private and avoiding situations that would reveal the intricate artwork that covered most of her back. But Harrison's intuition was too sharp to fool indefinitely. "Yes, sir. The tattoo documents my experience as a prisoner and my eventual escape. It's a reminder of what I survived and what I learned during that time. I think it's time we saw it." The request was spoken softly, but Maria understood that it wasn't really a request. This was the moment she had been both dreading and anticipating since arriving at the training facility. The moment when her secret would finally be revealed and everyone would understand who she really was and what had brought her to military service. "Yes, sir." Maria stood and began unbuttoning her uniform shirt, her hands steady despite the magnitude of what she was about to reveal. As the fabric fell away, the tattoo that covered her entire back was exposed for the first time since her arrival at the training facility. The artwork was breathtaking in its detail and horrifying in its subject matter. Intricate black ink formed a map of her captivity, with dates marking significant events, geographic coordinates indicating locations where various traumas had occurred, and symbols representing the different phases of her imprisonment and eventual escape. But it wasn't just a record of suffering. The tattoo also documented her resilience, her refusal to surrender hope, and the gradual development of the skills that had eventually enabled her freedom. It was a story of survival written in ink, a permanent reminder of the experiences that had shaped her into the person she had become. Harrison studied the tattoo in silence for several minutes, his military training allowing him to interpret much of what he was seeing. The geographic references, the timeline of events, the symbolic representations of different survival techniques, all told the story of someone who had endured experiences that would have broken most people. "How did you escape?" he finally asked. "I learned to think like my captors, to understand their patterns and weaknesses. I developed skills in observation, evasion, and tactical thinking that allowed me to eventually exploit their mistakes. The same skills that helped me succeed in your assessment." Harrison nodded slowly, his understanding of Maria's capabilities finally complete. She hadn't succeeded through exceptional military training or natural talent. She had succeeded because she had already survived challenges that made military training seem manageable by comparison. "Your performance in the individual assessment wasn't exceptional for someone with your background," he said. "It was exactly what should be expected from someone who has already proven their ability to survive and overcome impossible circumstances." "Does that disqualify me from the program, sir?" Harrison was quiet for a long moment, considering the implications of everything he had learned. Maria's background was unusual, but her capabilities were undeniable. The question was whether her unconventional path to military service would be seen as an asset or a liability by the special operations community. "Quite the opposite, Santos. It confirms that you belong here more than any candidate I've ever evaluated. Your assessment performance demonstrates exactly the kind of thinking and capability that special operations demands, but, more importantly, it proves that your abilities are genuine rather than theoretical." Maria felt a wave of relief wash over her, followed immediately by something she hadn't expected: pride. For the first time since joining the military, someone understood not just what she could do but why she could do it. "However," Harrison continued, "your background raises questions about how to best utilize your capabilities. Traditional military structure might not be the optimal environment for someone with your experience and skills." "What are you suggesting, sir?" "I'm suggesting that we need to have a conversation about what kind of military career would allow you to make the greatest contribution to national security while also utilizing the full extent of your capabilities." As they continued to discuss her future, Maria realized that the individual assessment had been more than just a test of her military readiness. It had been a revelation of her true potential and the beginning of a military career that would be unlike anything she had imagined when she first decided to serve her country. The tattoo that she had hidden for so long was finally revealed, but instead of marking her as different or damaged, it had proven that she possessed exactly the kind of experience and capability that the military needed most. The mockery and doubt she had endured during training suddenly seemed insignificant compared to the possibilities that lay ahead. Maria Santos had found her place in the world, and it was exactly where she belonged.